Hey guys, Ron here, and over the last year I released videos on the best, worst, most controversial, and most underrated parts of each generation, and now it's finally time to talk about the most overrated aspects of every Pokémon generation. Keep in mind, overrated means something that is praised more than it should be, so literally all of the entries in this video are positive aspects of their generation. They're just not as good as some fans think they are. If people believe something is a 10 when in reality it's a 9, it's overrated, despite still being amazing. But I won't be talking about general things in Pokemon that are overrated, like entire games. Only individual aspects that are unique to certain Pokemon games. If something you anticipated to be in this video didn't make the cut, that means I personally believe it's justly rated, like the Sevi Islands or Z-moves, because fans don't really overpraise those things. Just remember that I'm going to be using the word generation and region interchangeably. I know the difference, but for organizational reasons, it's sometimes better to go in region order instead, because in Generation 1 we have the Pokemon themselves. I'm a big fan of the original 151, and this group deserves respect for being the #1 reason Pokemon kicked off in the first place. But with all the praise they get from nostalgic fans who started with Generation 1, or players who are only attached to the first generation, the rating of this dex is significantly higher than it should be when thinking about it objectively. The fact is, the Pokemon in this region suffer from some of the same flaws later designs have, and even display unique problems of their own, some of which come from the hardware limitations of the Game Boy. It's also evident that the concepts behind most Generation 1 Pokemon aren't as creative as the ones from later generations. I'm not going to nitpick and say that Gen 1 designs are just birds, rats, and Pokeballs, but the ratio of awesome designs to less interesting ones is basically the same as any other region. The art style and design philosophies of Gen 1 Pokemon are simply different, not objectively better. They were in the spotlight because they're the first, not because they're the best. The second most overrated aspect of Kanto is the non-linearity of the region. Sure, when it comes to Pokemon, freedom and choice is what most of us want, but when you have the option between two bland routes, it really doesn't matter. Especially if there isn't any level scaling, because if I take the route that wasn't designed to go through first, then the Pokemon and trainers I face later in the game aren't going to be much of a challenge or that exciting. I'd personally rather go on a set path if it means the challenge will be progressively harder, and the locations I travel through are going to be more extensive than the last. Kanto's non-linearity is ultimately a positive trait of the region, but it's not all it's chalked up to be. Johto's popularity makes it one of the most overrated regions, and I'd say the Johto region itself is the most overrated aspect. Of course, Johto has a unique identity, it's very traditional and quite pretty, but when it comes to traveling through the region, it's not anything special. In fact, it has many glaring problems when compared to other regions, but since Johto games allow you to enjoy double the amount of locations, many fans have this false perception that Johto alone is huge. In reality, while its dungeons and towns deserve the praise they get, the routes themselves are only a step above Kanto's, but aren't much competition when compared to the diverse and dynamic routes of the generations that come after it. And like Kanto, the non-linearity gives you a sense of freedom but has flaws, like making certain gyms way easier, trainers having very boring teams, and terrible party options. The actual geography is not on par with other aspects that elevate the entire game, like the Kanto postgame, another overrated feature. Here's the thing, it's one of, if not the best postgame features in Pokemon, but that means fans think it's a 10, when in reality it's more of an 8. Still a treat, but it was not perfectly executed. It's basically quantity over quality. Sure, you have another region to travel to, but it's rather shallow with very few events, and weak wild Pokemon, and most importantly, led to Johto having to depend on Kanto, instead of focusing on its own strengths. This is not inherently a bad thing. Johto was almost treated like a sequel after all, but the most beloved aspect of a region shouldn't be tied to another. Next is following Pokemon. I know this is more of a Gen 4 type of deal, but it's always used as a reason for Heart Gold and Soul Silver's supremacy, and I didn't know what other generational category to place it in. And I get it, like many others, I too think following Pokemon is a huge advantage of games that have it. It makes you bond with your Pokemon in an immersive way. There are literally no negative aspects to having properly implemented following Pokemon, like in Pokemon Let's Go, but it really only contributes to a tiny fraction of the gameplay and experience of any Pokemon game. Not to mention, tons of amazing Pokemon games don't even have this feature, so the fuss around following Pokemon is a little overblown. Do I believe following Pokemon should be part of every future Pokemon game? Yeah. But will it affect my enjoyment of a game if it isn't implemented? Not at all. So this huge outcry, despite how much it affects gameplay, is the reason it's overrated. And finally, Silver, your rival, is a relatively overrated character. Many people, including myself, believe that jerk rivals in general are overrated. I don't care as long as the rival has some kind of arc, an interesting reason to compete with you, preferably a tough challenge, and is somewhat likable. But considering Silver has minimal contribution to the plot, has no relationship with you whatsoever, has a very abrupt arc, and isn't much of a challenge, makes me question why people even care about him. Is it his connection to Giovanni? That isn't even mentioned in the main game. Is it the music? It's the music. Blue is done a bit better and has cool development across multiple generations, but Silver is lauded as an above-average rival when to many he's kind of average, at best. Gladion is a much better version of Silver in my opinion. Hoenn time! Here's the funny part. Hoenn only has one overrated aspect in my opinion, and it's hilarious because it's my favorite aspect of Emerald, and that is the Battle Frontier. How much I love it is proof that it's overrated, because even I can acknowledge its flaws. It was revolutionary for its time, and yeah, I too wanted to see it fully realized in ORAS, but that's because it never rose to its full potential in Emerald. While fun, the level cap and lack of physical and special split made it frustrating to build teams for the Battle Frontier. While I disagree that the battle styles were boring, I agree that it was tedious and unrewarding to master each facility. For how much I played it, which is hundreds of hours, I only got one symbol. While it was cool sailing to a new island, it wasn't much of an adventure considering there wasn't a lot to explore. Another aspect that is treated like a 10 when it's an 8. Still phenomenal though. Sinnoh's next with a decent batch of overrated elements. Let's see if any of these deserve the hype after BDSP comes out and manages to re-execute some of them. Team Galactic is up first. There are other villainous teams in Pokemon that receive a lot of flack for having boring grunts and dumb motivations, but while Team Galactic shares these negative traits, it's rarely criticized because of how cool Cyrus is. And even then, his plans are the same as other villains but on a larger scale. He's charismatic for his lack of charisma, and that's it. All his grunts have no motivation other than following the orders of their cult leader. At least in other Pokemon games, grunts agree with their leader's aspirations and therefore have a reason for carrying out their missions. Again, Team Galactic could be entertaining to some, but Gen 4's plot definitely deserves more scrutiny, when other Pokemon stories get more flack despite being more coherent. Next is exploration in Sinnoh. I believe Sinnoh is one of the most expansive regions, but at a cost, and some people simply disregard the toll that these weaknesses take. Many routes, while well constructed, have elements like swamps, snow, and fog that makes adventuring a massive slog. In some playthroughs, I don't even bother going to the Great Marsh, because it's not worth the trouble. HMs either make us backtrack or sacrifice our ideal team. The individual locations are some of the best in the franchise, but getting from place to place is often laborious. It helps make Sinnoh feel like an actual journey, for better or worse. The Sinnoh Underground is a cool feature, but while to some it's a place players spent their childhood mining in, to others it's a location they accessed once or twice and therefore never made any difference in their Sinnoh experience. It's a great idea, the items you find there are rewarding, but when playing alone, the vast maze is barren and useless. Also, the secret bases you can make are a downgrade from those we can build in Hoenn. I hope the Grand Underground and Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl makes me eat my words and brings charm to this labyrinth that desperately deserves more diverse terrain. The Gen 4 Battle Frontier is not as necessary as people make it seem. For one, it's tiny compared to the Gen 3 counterpart and has much less to do and explore. The 3 new facilities have incredibly unintuitive gimmicks that you need to read entire essays to get decent at, and at the end of the day, it's something I and a majority of players didn't touch and therefore deserves a little less demand than it currently does. Or at the very least, it needs a revamped modern version, because even the Gen 4 version isn't ideal. Finally, and I hate to say it, Cynthia is a bit overrated. I love her. She's a top-tier Pokemon waifu and an amazing trainer, but to many she's their automatic favorite champion. Steven has more plot relevance than her, and I personally have more trouble taking down Lance. Her team's above average, but it's far from impossible. I swear, in every playthrough I lose at least once to Steven or Lance, while I always beat Cynthia in the first try. Cynthia in Black and White, on the other hand, is devastating. She's a great character and I don't mind seeing her in every generation, but to many she's an S tier, while I personally believe she's A+. Unova. Gen 5 used to be the most underrated generation, while many believe it to now be the most overrated because of how much praise it gets. But that's more about the entire game or generation as a whole. What are individual aspects that are overrated? Not many, but the elements that are overrated are huge, like the story. Yes, I also believe that Gen 5 story is the best in the franchise, but that's a very low bar to clear. There are only 2 games I say have an above average story, and that is Pokemon Black and White and Sun and Moon. And even then, Sun and Moon has a better plot. A game's story is defined by the elements that make up the world, its characters, their backstory, and the locations in our narrative. The plot, however, is the series of events that the viewer is being told or experiencing in sequence, and if you take those definitions into account, Sun and Moon's plot is better in execution. Black and White's plot is very sparse and rushed at the end, despite having cool characters, exciting twists and turns, and interesting themes. The setup and payoff isn't as proficiently told as Sun and Moon's plot, which is very character-driven. For Pokemon, Unova's story is a 9, but by plot standards it's a 6. And then we have Black and White 2's Challenge Mode. Whenever people insist on difficulty modes in Pokemon, they point at the existence of Challenge Mode in Black and White 2, as if it's a good example, when in reality, this feature should never be considered a well-executed aspect of Black and White 2. It's not part of the many accomplishments that these games had. It's the most terribly executed difficulty setting I've ever seen in my life. Not only do you have to defeat the champion to unlock the mode, and therefore need to replay the game all over again to experience the relatively minor changes, but only Black 2 has the key to unlock the feature, and White 2 players have to link with Black 2 players who've beaten the game to acquire the key. It's preposterous. Black 2 is my favorite Pokemon game, but it could have been everybody's favorite if these modes were unlocked from the start. Kalos is another region that in modern times isn't heavily praised, and therefore doesn't have many aspects that are overrated. But we all know this was coming. Mega Evolution. I love them just as much as the average player, but considering I don't play competitively, these forms made no difference in my Gen 6 experience. While I'm a big fan of the designs and lore, I rarely use them in-game, and while exciting, they kinda make it necessary for every team to run some kind of Mega. A lot of fans think it's the single best feature added to Pokemon, and needs to come back. I agree that they should return, but design-wise, I personally think Gigantamax forms were more interesting and scratched my itch for alternative forms. This is such a controversial take that a majority don't even believe it's overrated. They weren't as balanced as they should be, and many Pokemon who deserved Megas didn't get them, while strong Pokemon ended up becoming overpowered. It definitely had the most potential out of any mechanic introduced, and I'm all for it returning with revamped execution so it can continue to give underutilized Mons a chance to shine. I'll say that everybody acts like it's a 10 when it's a 9. Is that fair? Generation 7, baby. Alola has become the most underrated region now that it's criticized, so it makes it rather tough to find something overrated. But trials are the only thing I could come up with. Let me explain, since that's kind of what I've been doing for the last 12 minutes. I'm a big fan of the Island Challenge and specifically Totem Pokemon. I think they called for more strategy than gym battles and were a very nice change of pace. A positive representation of Alola's culture, just like the trials that you have to perform before challenging a totem and ultimately a kahuna. But the actual trials themselves are just glorified puzzles. Most of them involve tasks that are sometimes less intricate than the average gym puzzle and definitely don't test any skill that is necessary in Pokemon. They're very straightforward and sometimes tedious. I still love the Island Challenge though. Well, that was quick. Gen 8, the most scrutinized generation of all time, so will it be hard to find something people overpraise? Well, not really, since because of its notoriety, some people, including myself, may overcompensate and exaggerate the merits of its positive elements. This is the only time you'll catch me saying this, but I think the music of Generation 8 is overrated. Pokemon music is my entire life. I prioritize music way more than the average fan, believe me. That means I love the Sword and Shield soundtrack just as much as the next guy, probably even more. But since a lot of fans took notice of how much the soundtrack is tied to the experience of the game and how necessary it is to play Sword and Shield with the sound on, it feels like people talk about this soundtrack more than the average OST, despite it being an average Pokemon soundtrack. I personally believe it's not the best Pokemon soundtrack, but far from the worst. And even the worst is really good. Even people who hate Sword and Shield will admit that at the very least, the soundtrack is great. But that's not because it's above average for Pokemon, but rather because Pokemon always has above average music. Galar definitely excels in its battle themes and leitmotifs, but unlike other regions, it lacks a good amount of strong root music and iconic overworld themes, considering the tiny amount of routes and dungeons Galar has. Next is an odd one, cause I can't get enough of her. Marnie is an overrated character. I'm a huge Marnie fan. I think she has one of the best designs in the franchise, one of the best battle themes, a great backstory, and super endearing personality. But she's barely in the game and is far less important than any other character. Even people she's associated with, like Team Yell and peers, contribute more to the plot. Even rivals like Bede had an arc. Marnie didn't. Mostly cause she's already perfect. But there, you see, I'm overrating her. I just can't help it. She had the potential to be a 10, but is realistically an 8. If you want an actual 10, look at Sonia. And finally, while the DLC may be an honorable mention for the fact that everything in it should have been in the game, considering they were my favorite part of Sword and Shield and relatively controversial, I don't think they were overrated. So the final spot goes to the main game wild area. The wild areas in the DLC are way better, like an upgrade in every single way. Not perfect, considering before the DLCs came out, I believed the main game wild area was one of the best aspects of Sword and Shield, so I think my rating of these locations should be lowered. The wild areas in mainland Galar are relatively boring, with bland textures and low draw distance. The DLC wild areas are more dynamic, diverse, and beautiful. And if you thought this video was beautiful, check out my video on the most overrated parts of each generation, as well as the best, worst, and most controversial. Leave a like and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and check the description for the t-shirts I made for you guys, my Patreon, or click the join button to become a member and get awesome rewards like seeing my videos days early or Pokemon icons near your comments. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram, and I'll see you guys very soon.